First of all, thank you very much for the invitation for this Congress. My name is Maximo Torero. I am a Senior Research Fellow at IFPRI, International Food Policy Research Institute. And what we are going to talk today about is some work that we have been doing at IFPRI to try to find ways in which we can measure better food loss, and especially food losses across the value chain. The idea is to identify different techniques to be able to have a better measurement and to compare them to the traditional way of measuring food loss and waste. So I will do a presentation and I hope you will enjoy it. Thank you. The reality of food losses is an effort to try to find better ways in which we can measure losses, and especially losses across the value chain. This is work done together with Luciana Delgado from IFPRI and Monica Schuster from University of Antwerp. They both collaborate with me in developing this research, this paper. So first, let's start with some of the key facts. Reducing food loss and waste can contribute to food security and sustainability, but there is a lack of knowledge about the real magnitude of the food loss and waste, and that's a major barrier when we try to address this problem. There are estimates that vary from 27%, 1 billion tons, to 32%, 1.3 billion tons of all food produced in the world. There are significant differences across studies at the global and regional and at the country level, which makes this even worse. So what we have seen up to now is that there is a significant variance in terms of the magnitudes, and that's where this paper wants to achieve a marginal improvement on how to measure this. And of course, food loss and waste has become a priority, a policy priority. It's part of the SDGs. It's 12.3, is on food loss and waste, and it's linked to SDG 2, 12.5, 11.7, 17, and the goal is to halve per capita global food waste at the retail and consumer levels and reduce food losses along production and supply chains, including post-harvest losses by 2030. It has also been part of the G20 process. In the G20 of Turkey, there was a platform launched by FAO and IFPRI to try to bring evidence on how we can improve measurement and what we know in terms of reducing the level of food loss and waste. And the focus is to reduce the level of losses at both the global, regional, and national levels. Now, what do we try to achieve in this paper, in this presentation? First is to look at the existing methods to measure losses. And please note that we are going to focus only on food loss. We are not going to touch waste. There is enormous amount of literature today on waste. The objective of this paper is just to focus on food loss, so before the part when it's sold to the consumers, which is the waste component. In this paper, we propose a new methodological measurement, which is consistent to the WRI and all the current measurements. So this doesn't run in a parallel way and try to deviate from it. But basically, the innovation is that we look across the value chain. Normally, it has been done at the end of the value chain, in the post-harvest site. Here, we try to go back and look at the whole value chain and try to identify in which node of the value chain the losses occur. The second innovation is that we account for quantity, as traditionally was done, but also for quality and the value of the loss. That's really important, because if we are moving towards a world of standards and a world of better diets with high-value commodities, the quality issue is extremely important. And when a produce is delivered with a lower quality, it has an effect over price, and that's a loss, and that's what we want to identify. And finally, we try to identify some of the reasons or the causes behind the food loss. And we do, to be able to achieve this, we do an application on 5 commodities in 6 countries to get some cross-country consistency and try to see how the methodology evolves in different commodities. Now, what is the problem today, and what we try to improve? First, the problem is that there is a huge confusion on definition. And that's why in many cases why the numbers are not comparable. In some cases, we're trying to measure quantity versus quality, weight, caloric, nutritional, and economic loss, edible versus non-edible, real loss versus reuse, and so on and so forth. So unless we have a clarity of what exactly we're measuring at the beginning, then this will create a serious problem. In our specific case, we are going to focus on losses of edible food across the value chain, in which we are going to incorporate the effect of quantity and the effect of quality of the loss. We are not going to talk about waste. So this paper focuses on losses across the value chain of edible food and focuses on quantity and quality of the loss. Now, because of these multiple definitions, the literature has a huge variation, even by commodity. So, for example, if we look at this graph, we can observe that for cereals, there's a huge variance, the vertical line, in terms of the level of losses reported by doing this meta-analysis on all the papers. Similar in fruits and vegetables, the variance is smaller in the case of oilseeds and animals, but and on roots still is high. So with this variance, for example, it's very difficult to be able to measure or to use these parameters in a model, for example, because the variance is so high that the results of the scenarios will be completely different. Not only that, if we start looking at the review in terms of the commodity and the country, we find that the results are even inconsistent within a country and within a commodity. Let's look, for example, the case of maize in the case of Tanzania. The last 3 bars of this graph, 3 different papers, 3 completely different levels of losses. The paper of Makel says there is a loss of 40%, while other papers are in around less than 20% or around 20%. So it's not only in the aggregate level of the parameters, it's also in the same country with the same commodity. And again, that brings again the question of what is wrong, well, why we are not able to come up with a consistent methodology and how we can resolve this problem. What are the challenges? First, there is not accurate information about the extent of the problem, and that especially applies to developing countries, where the loss issue is more important than the waste issue compared to developed countries. There is very scarce evidence regarding the sources of the food loss, and there is little evidence regarding how to successfully reduce the food loss. Now, if we don't know what is the magnitude and we don't know where it happens across the value chain, it's very difficult to come up with policies. So the goal of this paper is to contribute to the first 2 challenges, to improve the quantification of food loss, and to characterize the nature of food loss across the value chain for different commodities in a wide array of countries. So that's what we want to achieve. It's a modest achievement, but that's what this paper aims to do. What is our proposed methodology? First, we bring the value chain concept. Food loss occurs at different stages of the value chain. It could occur in the pre-harvest, in the production process, in the post-production, in the procedures, in the processing, what we call the post-harvest. To resolve this, we are collecting information at the different levels of the value chain, and we do representative surveys. So essentially, we collect information on producers, and then we roll over to the intermediaries and to the processors, so that we have 3 different types of surveys in the 3 main nodes of production process. And that will allow us to identify where and in what part of the production process the problem occurs. Normally, we are used to hear that most of the losses occur in the post-harvest part of the production process. Let's see if that is the case once we look at the numbers and what we analyze. What we are measuring here is we distinguish food losses by looking at the physical quantities and quality of the value. So we are bringing not only the quantity loss, but also we are bringing the quality of the loss. And we compare 4 alternative methodologies. The traditional method, that's normally how we call it, which is basically a method in which is a self-report of the aggregate level of losses, and we bring up 3 new methods into the discussion. So what are these 3 different approaches relative to traditional method? So the traditional method is what we call the self-reported method, for example, used by Kaminsky and Christensen, where basically they ask an aggregate question to the producer how much he thinks he has lost in the production. Minten-Bar does the same thing also in his 2 papers when he looked at theft in the case of Ethiopia. Our concern is that we want to go a little bit over that. So basically we want to disaggregate measure. And not only disaggregate in terms of the nodes of the value chain, but also trying to identify within those nodes if we can get better information by looking at categories, by looking at attributes of the commodity, or by looking at prices reported by farmers. So in the category method, based on the evaluation of a crop and the classification of that crop into quality categories, this is what we normally would call standards. In some countries, like in China, for example, as we will observe, those standards are predefined. The second method is the attribute method, based on the evaluation of a crop according to the inferior visual, tactile, and olfactory product characteristics. And that allows us to identify what is the level of loss based on those attributes that the commodity needs to have to be able to be sold properly in the market. And finally, the price method, which basically is based on the idea that a higher or lower values of a commodity reflect higher or lower quality of the product. So the 3 methods, the category, the attribute, and the price method, are supposed to measure the same thing in different ways. And if everything was correct, they should aggregate to the aggregate self-reported method. Our hypothesis is that these three methods that go more in detail across the value chain and more in detail on the attributes and categories of the project could bring less measurement error than an aggregate report. It's similar to what we do when we do consumer surveys. No? When we look at expenditure, we can ask for aggregate expenditures or we can ask for disaggregate expenditures. And the idea is if that will improve over the self-reported methods. Now, if we get consistent results in our three proposed new methods, category, attribute, and price, and they are different to the self-reported method, we will argue that it's better to do these disaggregated measures and we can get better numbers. But again, this is not a perfect measurement. We are not looking specifically into the commodities and trying to measure the loss. That's something that we are doing now for Honduras and Guatemala to see consistency with our three new methods. So what data we use to calculate that? We develop our own data. We collect these surveys for the selected commodities. We collect random sample for the three elements, producer, middleman, and processor. We develop specialized questionnaires for the commodity, and that's very important because given that we're going to use categories and attributes, we need to be very specific to the commodity. So a survey for maize is not the same as a survey for rice or for wheat or for potatoes. Today we are doing cassava, for example, and other commodities in Africa. The methodology is consistent and comparable across commodities, although the questionnaires are different. We calculate the same numbers and the same structure. And also the questionnaires have a set of questions that allow us to understand what are the factors that create these losses, what explain the losses, so that we can understand which policies we can do. Once we know the magnitude, where they are, then we can understand what policies can be implemented to resolve this problem. Now, what are the results? So this is the first summary of our results. So what we're trying to show here is for each of the countries. So in the horizontal axis, you have Ecuador, Peru, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Ethiopia, and China. And then you have in each column the different methods. S is self-reported, subjective, what we call the traditional methods. C is the category method. A is the attribute method, and P is the price method. So the first thing to observe is that our three new methods, the last three columns in each country group, are very similar in terms of the magnitude, compared to the subjective method, the first column, where there is a significant difference between the three methods that we are proposing and the subjective method. The second thing to look at carefully is that the green shade is extremely important, and that's basically the percentage of losses that occur at the farmer level. And then the red, which is the middleman, and the blue, which is the wholesaler, are a small proportion. So what this is saying to us is that this is a little bit different to what we normally hear, that most of the losses occur at the post-harvest level. What this is telling us that a significant amount of the losses, almost a significant part of them, occur at the producer level, at the farmer level, pre to the harvest. So throughout the different estimation methodologies, losses at the producer level represent between 60 and 80% of the total value of the losses. Again, it's very different to what we hear in terms that most of the losses are at the post-harvest level. Here we are clearly identifying for each of the countries and the commodities that at the producer level, we have 60 to 80% of the total value of the losses. The average loss at the middleman and processor level lies between 7 and 19% of the total value chain losses respectively. So while the estimation results from the three new methods implemented are close and the differences are mostly non-significant, the aggregate self-reported method reports a different magnitude, a smaller magnitude to what we are observing. Again, this tells us that our three methods seems to be consistent, so it will tell us that is showing an improvement in terms of the reduction of the measurement error. And again, here we're just presenting the farmer losses at the producer level, to show the level of the magnitude that it has for all the different commodities. Now, what were the major problems that we identified when we would try to understand what was going on? First, there were weather-related issues. Farmers report a lot of problems with weather-related issues. Lack of knowledge of available technology, pests and plagues. They didn't know how to resolve those problems. And also an issue of mechanization and access to infrastructure. Lack of access to infrastructure and mechanization also create problems, especially in the commodities which were more high value. And finally, the lack of price incentives to standards. Given that they were not existing and they were not incentive existing, then it was important to understand how we can do that. Here what we do is we select two of the value chains, the potato value chain in Peru and Ecuador, and we try to understand what are the different levels and the reasons for the loss in the two different value chains. So for example, let's focus on the first row, the Ecuador potato. So when we try to understand in the pre-harvest what was the major problem is pest and disease. In Peru, on the other hand, the major problem is between pest and disease, but also the lack of rain. So lack of rain seems to be very important. And another problem which seems to be important is weather, freezing, which is not so important in the case of Ecuador. When we look at the product left in the field, what is the major cause of the product left in the field? In Ecuador, it's mostly a small or poor quality of potatoes. In the case of Peru, the major problem is because of post-harvest technique and lack of costly labor, so lack of appropriate labor to do the harvest. We also tried to identify if there were some heterogeneous effects, and we looked at education and experience, and we found positive correlation with education and losses. We didn't find any gender differences by commodity. It's important to say also that most of the producers are males, but again, we'll try to look at it. We found some positive results on beans, but not for maize, in the case of Central America. In terms of access to markets, we found that it's positively correlated with reduction of losses. So the closer you are to the market or the better connected to the market through better roads, the lower the losses you will have. In terms of technology and improved seeds, access to them are also positive correlated with reduction of losses. And with mechanization, we didn't find a clear effect of the potential impacts. So, just to conclude, we can say that our three new methodologies aim to reduce the measurement error, and we find some consistency across them in difference to what we call the traditional methods. All of them are self-reported. We need to be clear on that. The aggregate traditional method is self-report, and our disaggregate method is also self-report. But what we are saying is that because of the level of disaggregation and the level of analysis, both in the attributes and in the category method, we are able to reduce the measurement error compared to the traditional methods. Loss figures across all value chains fluctuate between 6 and 25% of total production, of total produced value. Across the different estimations and methodologies, we identify that the losses at the producer level are between 60 and 80%. And that's important. That's very different to what we have been here traditionally. The average loss in the middlemen is 7 and 19. That means that the middlemen are really being very careful on what they buy. And therefore, their level of losses are a lot lower. And that makes all the sense of the world. They're trying to minimize what they're going to lose when they sell to the processors. So they're very careful in selecting what they buy. And finally, the presence of pests, lack of rainfall, and lack of appropriate post-harvest technologies and access to markets seems to be the major factor behind the losses identified in our study. So thank you very much for letting me present this paper, joined with Luciana Delgado and Monica Schuster. But again, for us, it's very important that these results are shared, and we hope that we can keep improving the way we measure losses. Again, just to have an idea, the time our surveys take in each of the nodes is around 30 minutes, and in the intermediary is around 15 to 20 minutes on the processor. So we think that we can even improve, because now if we show that the three methodologies are the same, we can run only with one, and that could make it very viable to be able to be replicated by the private sector. Again, thank you, and apologies for not being there.